This is a piece of cardboard. It was printed in 1993 in a factory in Belgium on the same presses that made ordinary playing cards. It was simply a small rectangle of cardstock, a few grams of paper and ink, one of millions produced in a single print run, an ordinary industrial product intended for a game. It came in a pack that cost $2.45. There were 15 cards in the pack. Nobody knew which ones they were until they opened it. The hidden contents were the engine. Within each sealed packet lay an unknown future, a tantalizing whisper of fortune. This wasn't merely a game piece, it was a lottery ticket, sold for a few dollars. People bought the thrill of possibility, believing they understood the odds. They could not have been more wrong about what they were truly buying. In January of 2021, one of these cards, signed by the man who drew it, was sold at auction. $511,000 for a piece of cardboard that had cost a fraction of a cent to print. What exactly was being sold in that auction room? It was not just paper and ink. It was a perception, a sealed, authenticated object presented with reverence as if it were an ancient relic, a piece of modern art perhaps, or a rare jewel. But it was only cardboard. The price, however, was real, and it forced a question. What do we actually believe money is? To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the beginning, not to a boardroom or a bank, but to a basement south of Seattle, where 7 friends were about to accidentally invent a new kind of money. America in 1993 was already a country of collectors. Mall stores were full of baseball cards, comic books, and figurines. People were learning to trade in scarcity, to believe in the value of the rare. And the first modems were just starting to connect them, creating new markets where belief could travel faster than ever before. It was a perfect environment for something new to become something else entirely. They thought they were making a game, and they were. But the game would not stay a game, and the cards would not stay toys. The film you are about to see contains 2 distinct narratives. One is the story of a group of friends who began their company on the belief that games could be made by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. This was their founding principle, established in a basement in Kent, Washington in 1990. The other narrative is about power and capital. It explains how that small, enthusiast-run company would ultimately use its unexpected wealth to purchase the fallen giant that owned Dungeons & Dragons. These 2 stories, of earnest intention and market consequence, were always bound together. In the spring of 1990, in the basement of a rented house south of Seattle, 7 friends founded a company. They kept their day jobs. They priced the stock at 50 cents a share, and they named the company after a wizard's guild from a game they had played together for years. None of them thought of it as a business. They thought of it as a promise.
Well, I was roommates with Russ Woodall. We were living in Redmond, and Russ, I gather, already had some degree of involvement, and he said, well, you know, Peter started this company, and he recently just, you know, incorporated it, and you know, it's role-playing games. Well, you know, what more do you want?
Right.
So I said, well, sure, I'm in. You know,
Yeah,
so, I knew Peter, right?
Yeah, because Wizards is known for Magic the Gathering, but we didn't start with Magic the Gathering. We started to do with role-playing games. We started with Wizard Coast. We're going to do role-playing games. Yeah.
These were colleagues from Boeing, systems analysts and engineers by day, but in the quiet hours, they were adventurers. For years, their weekends and evenings had revolved around the shared narrative of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. forging bonds stronger than any corporate hierarchy. The basement of Peter Adkison's rented house was their sanctuary, a humble space filled with the comfortable clutter of well-loved games, where the real work of imagining worlds began. It was here, amidst the stacks of rulebooks and the faint echo of past dice rolls, that they sought to build something new, not just for themselves, but for a wider community of like-minded souls. For these friends, the game was a covenant. Week after week, they gathered, sometimes arguing the finer points of a spell for hours, sometimes celebrating a hard-won victory that had been years in the making. This deep, shared history, built on loyalty and a collective imagination, was the true bedrock of their ambition.
What I remember about this era is just how dedicated you were to it. Like you wanted.
I was an anal retentive, is what I was trying to say. I was very proper, professional, keep it all clean, and
But you were ambitious. You remember what you told me?
I was ambitious. I came to Peter. I don't mind saying I put a little pressure on Peter to give me an actual position. And he eventually made me vice president of research and development, which I took as a good sign. But yeah, I mean.
Around that table, they pooled not just their passion, but their meager savings, each small check a testament to belief. Peter Adkison, the group's quiet organizer, meticulously recorded every share in a simple ledger, believing in a future for the role-playing games he loved. His careful entries marked the translation of friendship into a nascent company, one hopeful step at a time. This was how they built, by hand and by trust, the early foundations of their shared ambition. The name itself, Wizards of the Coast, held a deeper meaning than mere branding. It was a familiar banner drawn directly from a wizard's guild in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign that had shaped their collective imagination since 1979. Into that shared ledger, Peter Adkison pressed the tip of a fountain pen. Each line, marking a transfer of 50 cents a share, felt less like a financial transaction and more like a quiet, ceremonial vow. These were not just numbers, but promises, carefully inscribed, one by one.
We believed these modest investments, each share a fraction of $1, were not merely capital, but a compact. They were funds gathered to pursue a singular, cherished ambition, to publish the role-playing game products we ourselves longed to play. This was the true currency of our venture.
The collective belief, painstakingly gathered check by small check, eventually amounted to just under $300,000. This was, in total, every dollar the company would ever take from outside investors, a sum that felt vast to its founders, yet was laughably small by the standards of the industry they hoped to enter. They planned for worlds and heroes, for epic adventures and intricate rulebooks, dreaming of a future where their passion could become a livelihood. But in the cold light of the market, this was barely enough to print a single modest game. It was a testament not to financial power, but to the sheer, stubborn conviction of 7 friends who believed in something more than profit. They saw not a limitation, but a challenge, a testament to what ingenuity and a little faith might achieve.
Help
you want
us
to jump ahead?
Yeah, well, let's.
We can jump over that I had invested in the company. You know, that happened. Even though I had to use one of those $1,000 credit cards you get in the mail because you're a college graduate.
Okay, so how did you even know about the company and have
Well, Dave had been trying to get me to come work for you.
Okay.
He was like, Carol, you're cool. You should come work with us. And I was like, you're publishing one role-playing book, and this other, I think you had the
Talislanta.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know that you have something for me to do, and also at the time that no one was getting paid.
Yeah, that's true. There was there was that period.
There was that time.
Yeah.
So I was like, no, Dave, it's cool. It's a cool
Or
company.
then they got paid for a while, but then they didn't get paid again.
Yeah. So I thought, no, maybe not at this time, but I did know, I was aware and knew what was going on, and so yes, we got invited to the party you threw to try and get invested.
Their initial vision was humble: to offer a quiet service to the thriving world of role-playing games. They sought to create not new universes of their own, but elegant supplements and guides that would enrich the stories already being told by other publishers. It was a respectful nod to the giants they admired, a way to contribute to a community they cherished, hoping to find their own small place within its grand design. This quiet ambition was the compass that first guided them. For these friends, and for millions of others, the universe of role-playing was centered on a single, towering creation: Dungeons and Dragons. Its adventures spanned decades, its lore was rich, and its publisher, TSR, was the undisputed monarch of this realm. From their small basement in Kent, the idea of ever meeting, let alone joining, such a distant giant in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, felt as fantastical as the dragons in their own campaigns. They merely sought to contribute a quiet note to that grand symphony. Their commitment was practical, carved from the edges of their working lives, a quiet dedication pursued after hours and on weekends, never risking the steadiness of their Boeing paychecks. But the systems of the world operated on their own schedule. Before the company had sold much of anything, barely 2 months after its first product, a humble sourcebook, reached the hands of a few thousand players, a federal lawsuit arrived. Palladium Books, another publisher, claimed copyright and trademark infringement over the startup's conversion notes. They demanded an acknowledgement of guilt. For a basement company with negligible revenue, this was not a challenge to be overcome. It was an existential threat, a liquidation event already in progress. The rules of this new game, it turned out, were far harsher than any they had designed for their own. Our legal action, initiated on June 17, 1992, against Wizards of the Coast, stemmed from their publication's specific guidance, conversion notes, designed to interface with our established game systems. This, we argued, constituted an infringement upon our protected marks and copyrights. The mechanisms of law, unconcerned with sentiment or shared passion, now demanded payment. The arithmetic of survival became stark. A company founded on 50-cent shares and the belief of a few friends now faced legal fees that would soon dwarf its entire capital, threatening to extinguish it not with a bang, but with a balance sheet. 9 months later, in March 1993, the mechanism of the law finally yielded a settlement. It required an undisclosed cash payment, arbitrated by a neutral party, and a promise that Wizards of the Coast would never speak of Palladium again. Industry veterans universally agreed the lawsuit had nearly killed the company. But the threat had forced a strange kind of clarity. The secret card game, an asset too valuable to risk, was swiftly moved into a separate shell company called Garfield Games. It was stock in this new, legally insulated entity that would raise the money for the first print run. The company had learned its first lesson about capital. Sometimes, the greatest value lay not in the investor, but in the invention itself. But for Peter Adkison and his friends, this was not a moment to surrender. They absorbed the blow as a collective, their shared commitment unbroken. They kept their day jobs at Boeing, their steady paychecks now funding legal battles instead of dreams, and quietly continued to publish, certain that the spirit of their games would out.
The basement, intended for creation, held instead the quiet weight of their first product's limited reach. Stacks of their published role-playing books, unsold, became a constant, tangible reminder of ambition's early struggle against the indifferent market. It was a space that carried the faint, specific scent of new paper mingling with the quiet echo of unmet expectations. Yet, through it all, no one turned their back on the shared venture. They found resolve not in soaring sales, but in the simple act of showing up, day after day, to that humble, crowded room, believing in the eventual promise of their collective work.
None of the external pressures, the weight of unsold books, the looming legal battle, the sheer uncertainty, could erode the core of their alliance. Instead, that small, crowded space became a crucible, refining their shared purpose. They understood that this venture, born of late-night games and mutual trust, was more than just a business. It was an extension of their deepest friendships, a collective dream they simply refused to abandon. Yet, while they endured in that basement, believing in their quiet promise, their future was already being shaped, hundreds of miles away, in the mind of a mathematics professor in Portland. They had started with a clear purpose: to publish role-playing game products, the kinds of supplements and adventures they themselves adored. Their first, a book called The Primal Order, was a systemless sourcebook on gods and religion, an earnest effort to enrich the lore of countless campaigns. It sold about 2,500 copies in its first 6 months, a respectable debut for a small, independent publisher, yet a quiet testament to the immense labor involved in bringing even a single book to market. For all their shared passion, for all the late nights and pooled resources, the numbers spoke with a gentle, sobering finality. The market, it seemed, had other ideas for their ambition. Getting their creations into stores meant confronting the hard realities of a business built on thin margins and even thinner patience. They sent books out on consignment, hoping for sales, only to see many returned, gathering dust in the basement, each package a quiet lesson in the unforgiving economics of shelf space. It was a patient, often humbling education, showing them that the love of a game alone could not guarantee its place in the world. Peter Adkison, a lifelong player himself, had always envisioned Wizards of the Coast as more than just a place to sell books. He wanted it to be a mark of quality, a trusted name in the role-playing community he cherished. The ambition wasn't to build an empire, but to create products that would earn a respected place on players' shelves, alongside the beloved classics. It was a quieter, more personal kind of success they sought, measured not in millions, but in the enduring appreciation of fellow gamers. This was the gentle yet deeply held ambition that propelled their early days, a hope to simply belong.
These were the first lessons in a demanding apprenticeship, though they didn't know it then. Every returned book, every modest sale, taught them the quiet realities of a market that rarely rewarded passion alone.
By the late summer of 1991, Peter Adkison found himself in a quiet bind. His small company, born of friendship in the basement, was struggling to find its footing, and a lawsuit threatened to engulf it. But then, a connection made through the nascent online world of Usenet led to a meeting in Portland. Over pizza, a mathematician named Richard Garfield laid out his latest board game, a complex invention called Robo-Rally. Adkison listened patiently, but he knew his fledgling venture couldn't afford the miniatures and elaborate boards it would require. He needed something different. He asked instead for a game that was portable and quick, something players could carry and enjoy simply, perhaps even while waiting in line at the very conventions that were the lifeblood of their shared hobby. It was a humble request, born of necessity, but it would change everything. Richard Garfield, a mathematician by nature, saw not a constraint in that simple request, but a fascinating problem to solve. He carried the idea with him for days, turning it over in his mind. A game both expansive and intimate, played with hundreds of unique pieces, yet light enough to fit in a pocket. A new vision began to form, a strange synthesis of old collecting habits and dueling magic, sketched out on whatever scrap of paper he found. On a napkin, perhaps, or in the margins of his own notes, Richard Garfield began to sketch the solution. He saw a game without a fixed board, where players brought their own secret decks, each a unique collection of cards they had chosen. These cards would cycle through their hands, spells cast and creatures summoned, creating a duel where every game felt new. It was a vision of endless possibility, contained in a single deck. As they parted ways that day in Portland, a quiet excitement settled between them, the first whisper of a future neither could fully comprehend. A combinatorics PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, Richard Garfield possessed a mind uniquely suited to the challenge. He had been raised on games, from the structured elegance of chess to the expansive freedom of Dungeons and Dragons, which he often noted broke all the traditional rules. For him, games were more than mere diversions. They were complex systems, ripe for analysis, where rules created worlds of emergent possibility. He understood how to build such systems, how to balance luck and skill, and how to make a finite set of rules feel truly infinite in its outcomes. This was the fertile ground of his imagination, where the seeds of a new kind of game would take root. For years, Richard Garfield had wrestled with a fundamental question at the heart of all games: the delicate interplay of luck and skill. He often articulated this in his academic lectures, proposing that true elegance lay not in removing chance, but in crafting systems where thoughtful play could consistently overcome the whims of fortune. It was a lifelong intellectual pursuit, a puzzle he was always on the verge of solving.
Luck. And I believe that's a false dichotomy that you can have games with a lot of luck and a lot of skill, and you can have games with very little luck and very little skill. So oftentimes, in order to demonstrate ideas or explore a concept, what I like to do is come up with toy games. A toy game is a game which is constructed to make a point, but it's not a game which you would want to play because they tend not to be fun. Rando chess is very much not fun. But it demonstrates this, this idea that there can be lots of luck and skill in a game. So with rando chess, the way you do it is you play standard chess.
For Richard Garfield, a game was less a static object and more a delicate ecosystem. Its rules were a kind of physics, setting boundaries and governing interactions, while the players, with their unpredictable choices, acted as a dynamic weather system, constantly shaping and reshaping the landscape. He saw the potential for emergent complexity, where simple inputs could lead to infinite, unscripted outcomes, making each session a unique, living experience. It was this understanding that would allow him to build a world into a deck of cards. For the brilliant mind behind it, the complex puzzle of this new game became an intellectual pursuit so captivating that his combinatorics doctorate would for a time simply have to wait. With the initial concepts laid out, the real work began in a quiet corner of the University of Pennsylvania's Astronomy Lounge. There, late one evening, Richard Garfield and a fellow student, Barry Bit Reich, set out to play the very first game of what they then called Mana Clash. They dealt out the first 120 handmade cards, each a crude prototype of an idea, and began to duel. The hours slipped away unnoticed, marked only by the shifting light of the moon through the windows, as the core mechanics of the game revealed themselves. It was only when they finally emerged, blinking, into the morning light, that they realized they had played through the entire night, captivated by a game that felt, even in its rough-hewn form, remarkably complete.
What they discovered that night, as the sun rose over the campus, was not just a game, but a new kind of game entirely. It was a game built not just on strategy, but on ownership. Players would assemble their own unique arsenals, choosing from a growing pool of cards they could collect, find, or, crucially, trade with one another. This meant the game itself would change and evolve with every exchange, every new card brought into play. It was a living, breathing system where the market was as much a part of the play as the spell.
The sunrise that greeted them, painting the campus in soft, new light, heralded more than just the end of an all-night session. It marked the quiet beginning of years of dedicated work. What had been glimpsed in those hours in the astronomy lounge was a profound design, a universe of interlocking rules and possibilities that would demand hundreds more cards, countless iterations, and a devoted cadre of playtesters. This was not a sprint, but a patient, secret construction, building out the full potential of a game whose true scope they were only just beginning to comprehend. In those intense hours in the astronomy lounge, the game they played bore the working title of Mana Clash, a name chosen after lawyers deemed magic itself too broad to protect. Over the next 2 years, the game continued its quiet evolution, iterated upon by a devoted circle of playtesters. These were not pristine, mass-produced artifacts, but crude, hand-cut pieces of paper, often adorned with marker scribbles and appropriated art. Playtest art director Scoff Elias famously used images ranging from Calvin and Hobbes to Spock, even his own foot, to stand in for the game's burgeoning cast of creatures and spells. Hundreds of such cards were photocopied, shuffled, and tirelessly tested on dorm tables and coffee shop counters, each session refining the delicate balance of the game. Though the ambition was clear, these early design sheets often carried the working title Mana Clash, a provisional name for a game that was still, in many ways, finding its true identity. It was a secret world, built piece by painstaking piece, far from the glare of any market. Over those 2 years, the playtesters uncovered the game's deepest secrets. They found astonishing combinations, some wildly unbalanced, demanding careful revision. But they also discovered the sheer joy of forging a unique deck, each an extension of their own personality, full of unforeseen strategies and unexpected interactions that made every duel a fresh revelation. Through those countless hours, the game began to take on a life of its own, captivating its creators in ways they hadn't foreseen. Playtesters would trade, argue, and even embargo each other, building miniature economies of cardboard right there at the table. Decks were played for keeps, for ante, until one player's collection was utterly exhausted. It was a clear, undeniable signal. They had stumbled upon something truly profound. Magic turned out to be one of the best economic simulations I had ever seen. The economy was based on cards, and it turned out to be about as predictable as the real thing. As the game took shape, a crucial design choice emerged from the countless hours of playtesting. To deepen the experience of discovery, to make each pack opened a moment of quiet anticipation, Richard Garfield decided that not all cards would be equally common. Some would be printed in smaller numbers, making them more elusive, more prized, transforming each booster into a tiny treasure hunt. It was a subtle decision, born of game theory, that would quietly reshape the very nature of collecting. This profound conviction, forged over 2 years of playtesting, meant market research was simply never consulted. They knew what they had. Such was the depth of this connection, this blend of game and life, that for one of its creators, the cards became a vehicle for a very personal question. Richard Garfield, ever the designer, secretly crafted 9 unique cards, each one an invitation to marriage, intended for Lily Wu. He slipped them into his deck, knowing it might take several games to draw the right one. When it finally appeared, an artifact designed not for battle, but for a lifelong partnership, the card declared, "If the proposal is accepted, both players win." It was a moment of quiet human beauty, woven directly into the fabric of the game itself, hinting at the profound significance these pieces of cardboard already held for those who brought them into being.
At its heart, this new game held a radical, almost subversive premise. The cards were not merely components for clay, but tangible property. Richard Garfield had woven into the very fabric of his design the idea that players would own these pieces of cardboard, collect them, and trade them as they saw fit. This quiet decision transformed the game from a static set of rules into a vibrant, living marketplace, where personal collections became extensions of strategy, and every exchange held a thrilling, unpredictable weight. Each card, no matter how humble, carried with it the potential for a new game, a new trade, a new story. It was an economy built not on gold, but on paper and imagination.
The game's very structure, born from Garfield's mathematical mind, invited this unpredictable dance of value. He understood that beyond mere play, the allure could lie in the hunt itself. So from the earliest design sheets, rarity was not an accident, but a deliberate feature. Some cards would simply be harder to find, printed in fewer numbers, ensuring that each new pack held the potential for a small, thrilling discovery. It was a choice that transformed collecting into a perpetual, quiet quest, where the true worth of a piece of cardboard was measured not just in its power on the table, but in the yearning it inspired.
Sure. In Magic, the distribution you got your mana was a very important something that I definitely thought about as this is a way I want to introduce luck into the game, and that no matter how good your deck is, if you don't draw the right mana, you might end up losing. And so in this way, I envisioned that a person who was not so good could occasionally beat somebody who was good, and that way you would have a broader audience.
In their fervent dedication, the playtesters didn't just follow the rules. They began to invent new ones, unspoken and organic. Their carefully curated collections, the rare cards they coveted, became a currency all their own within that small, intense circle. Deals were struck, favors exchanged, and a vibrant, if tiny, market emerged among them, shaping the very ecosystem of the game. This was a clear, human forecast of the profound shifts to come, long before the cards ever reached the wider world. Within the intricate web of its rules, Richard Garfield had, perhaps unintentionally, woven the seeds of a market that would eventually define it. In August of 1993, the faithful gathered in Milwaukee for Gen Con, eager for a glimpse of something new. But the game they had heard whispers of, printed far away in Belgium, was held captive by U.S. Customs. It took a flurry of phone calls and an overnight flight to finally free the boxes. On the convention's second afternoon, a truck pulled up to the loading dock, and some 20 volunteer gamers, wide-eyed and eager, began to carry the cases across the show floor. Peter Adkison himself was there, writing receipts by hand as the boxes were opened. This was not a business, not yet. It was a hopeful gathering, selling cards directly from the truck.
Amidst all the surging numbers and frantic trading, the quiet heart of the game remained. Players sat across from one another, focused intently on the cards, on the unfolding possibilities of each turn. For them, it was a moment of pure engagement, a challenge of wits and strategy that transcended the rising value of the cardboard. Here, at these tables, the game lived as it was always intended, a direct human connection. It was a shared language, spoken in shuffled decks and quiet decisions. They set up their small space with folding tables, each one draped simply, and hung signs drawn by hand. There was no grand display, no polished presentation, just the cards themselves and the quiet hum of anticipation. For those few days, amidst the noise of the convention, a new kind of magic was being unveiled, one eager player at a time. It felt like a secret share, a promise whispered that something truly special had arrived. Players tore open their booster packs right there on the floor, the cards spilling out, revealing unexpected treasures. Soon, they were not just buying new packs, but trading their finds with friends and strangers, a spontaneous market igniting between the tables. Lines began to form, not just for new product, but for the chance to see what others had, to swap, to collect. A murmur grew into a buzz, then a shared excitement. Something real, something beyond the cardboard, was taking hold. By Sunday afternoon, the boxes that had arrived with such urgency were empty. The supply, carefully calculated to last until the new year, had been swept away by an undeniable tide of excitement. Peter Adkison, still writing receipts, saw the final cards pass into eager hands and understood. This was no longer just a hobby or a hopeful venture. It was a phenomenon, demanding everything. The very next day, he walked away from his career at Boeing. The game had not simply launched, it had claimed its own future. The money flowed in so quickly, filling the small cash box again and again, until it could barely latch shut. The silence after Gen Con did not last. Phones in the small office began to ring. Distributors, having seen the demand, wanted more cards than the company could possibly print. So Wizards of the Coast printed, and printed again. The beta edition shipped in October, then unlimited in December. Retailers learned to order 10 times what they actually needed. They did this hoping allocations would fill a fraction of their request. The market was now teaching itself to believe in scarcity.
Back to the first day, though. The first day, I find out, we're sharing this desk and everything else, but I find out that it's not as much of a problem because people are working from home, people come in at various hours. The next day, I came in bright and early at like 8 a.m. and have the desk to myself, and I kind of was like, well, when's Lisa going to be in? And she worked a much later part of the day. So I was like, oh, well, here's a stack of phone messages that don't seem to have been replied to. But there's a stack of those little peel-off things with people's numbers. So I picked up the phone and I just started calling all these people.
By the way,
order received October 14th, beta edition. Quantity requested 50 cases. Anticipated fulfillment 5 cases. Instruct staff to submit all subsequent orders at minimum 300% of actual sales expectation. Repeat for all territories.
The company's own magazine, The Duelist, launched in 1994, and its pages quickly became essential reading. Within it, Wizards of the Coast announced future print runs, trying to manage expectations. But these announcements did not calm the market. Instead, they became news themselves, driving further speculation about what would be scarce and what would not. The presses in Belgium, operated by Carta Mundi, were running almost without cease. This was not a carefully orchestrated plan for market dominance. It was a reaction to a demand no one had predicted. A small company, still finding its footing in a basement, was learning the true bewildering physics of a commercial phenomenon.
every new shipment, larger than the last, was swallowed by a market that seemed insatiable, desperate for more. The sheer volume of cards now entering the world was unprecedented for a game. What began as a simple card game was becoming something else entirely, a commodity, its value driven by an endless, escalating hunger. And the company that had created it was now struggling to keep up with the very rules it had accidentally written for this new economy.
And so each successive wave of cards, larger than the last, was absorbed the moment it touched down. Even amidst the whirlwind, Peter Adkison still spent his nights at Boeing, often working into the late hours on the company's computers, keeping his young venture alive. There, in the quiet hum of the deserted offices, he found a friend in Mary, a janitor on the night shift. She watched him, hour after hour, pouring his energy into what must have seemed an impossible dream. One night, she approached him, insisting he take a portion of her savings. "It's my life savings," she told him, pressing $1,400 into his hand, even as her own children thought she had lost her mind. She simply believed in the man, and in the quiet, improbable promise of his basement company. Mary had seen the raw, tireless dedication in Peter Adkison's eyes. In a world where fortunes were built on grand designs and vast sums, her $1,400 was a small, quiet act of faith. It was a wager not on a product or a market, but on a man and the fragile hope he carried in his basement. She put her trust, her entire life's savings, into something most people would have dismissed as a fantasy, a fleeting passion. What she could not have known then, as the cards began to fly off the shelves, was that this small, courageous investment would soon become a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. It was a testament to belief, in the face of all reason. No grand declaration accompanied her gesture. Just a simple, profound trust in something she felt, not understood. After all the quiet acts of faith, the numbers themselves told the true story. From its launch in August, the game had sold 10 million cards in roughly 6 weeks. No one had planned for this. The demand had simply appeared, and the company was left to count the receipts. The Duelist swiftly became the game's authoritative voice. It was where players learned the lore, understood official rulings, and saw the first glimpses of cards yet to come. This publication was more than just a magazine. It was the official record of a rapidly evolving system. It told players what was permitted, what was powerful, and what they should want next. In this new economy, the company now published not just cards, but the very meaning of the game itself. It was the central bank of the game's emergent culture, defining its rules and fueling its desires. As the Christmas season of 1993 approached, the company found itself in an unexpected position, with almost no product left to sell. What they saw as a failure of supply, the market interpreted as something else entirely. The empty shelves and long wait lists became their most effective, if entirely accidental, marketing campaign. A shortage of cards during the busiest shopping season only intensified the hunger for them. It taught everyone that the game was not just popular, but precious. The company had now created something valuable beyond their wildest imaginings. This presented an immediate, confounding problem. Each new print run, intended to satisfy an insatiable demand, also carried the risk of flooding a market that had learned to value scarcity. But to not reprint meant the existing cards would become too expensive, closing the game off to new players. every path they considered seemed to threaten the delicate economy they had accidentally built. They were caught between the founding desire to make the game accessible and the emerging need to protect the speculative value of the cards already sold. The system they had unleashed was already dictating its own bewildering terms. The year ended with $2 million in revenue and the presses still running, but the company now understood it was in the business of managing an accidental economy. But then, something strange happened. Adults began to buy the cards, not to play them, but to keep them. Magazines appeared, whose only purpose was to say what a piece of cardboard was worth. And because the magazine said the cardboard was worth something, it was. The game had accidentally invented a small economy, and the company that printed the money couldn't decide whether to stop the presses or run them faster. Despite the rising prices and the urgent debates over scarcity, the cards were still, fundamentally, a game. Players drew hands, summoned creatures, and battled across tabletops. The same cardboard, now valued in magazines, also dictated strategy. This dual nature was often overlooked, but victory in the game still felt like a true prize. The first dedicated publication was Scry magazine, launched in June 1994. Its pages were filled with grids of numbers, assigning specific dollar figures to each card. These were not manufacturers' suggested prices, nor were they official market rates. They were simply the magazine's declaration of value. But as collectors and store owners began to consult these tables, the numbers became accepted truth. The price guide didn't reflect the market, it was the market. A piece of cardboard was worth precisely what the latest issues said it was worth. The market for these guides quickly grew. In April 1995, Inquest magazine arrived, published by the same company that made Wizard. It was glossier, louder, promising even greater insights into the cardboard economy. These new publications, like the Beckett guides for sports cards, solidified the idea that stacks of paper were assets. Teenagers studied their tables, learning to arbitrage value in their local shops. Soon, the cardboard itself began to look different. A simple 3-ring binder, once a place for children to store their collection, became something else entirely. It was a ledger. Its clear plastic sleeves, once holding playthings, now held assets. The value of these assets, printed in glossy magazines, was understood to be real money, and if it was real money, it was worth protecting. Publishers of these new guides began to describe the hobby in different terms. The word game now regularly shared space with investment. Inside these stores, a new kind of market took shape. Fluorescent lights reflected off glass display cases. Here, individual cards were arranged, each with a small, often handwritten price tag. These were not just items for sale. They were commodities, openly traded. Boys and grown men stood by, observing the shifting numbers. The card shop had become a tiny stock exchange, operating under the same logic. This new kind of value was not confined to specialist shops. It spread through the malls of America, where children once spent allowances on toys. Now that same money bought pieces of cardboard with fluctuating prices. The mall, a temple to mass consumption, had become the accidental home for a speculative asset. Everyone understood the rules without being told. Subject: Black Lotus price hike. The current valuation for a Mox Pearl remains purely speculative. While its scarcity is indeed undisputed, the practical utility of the card scarcely justifies a $30 price point. We must consider market saturation and projected future print runs, not merely initial demand surges. To claim otherwise is to ignore basic economic principles. The declared value was not the only value. On the nascent internet, in public forums known as Usenet newsgroups, strangers began to debate. They argued over scarcity, utility, and the projected worth of a piece of cardboard. These were digital trading floors, operating without brokers or central authority. No one dictated the price. Instead, through endless typed arguments and declarations, a consensus would slowly emerge. This collective belief, forged in text, became the market. The numbers on those tags or in the magazines were not enforced by law. They held simply because enough people chose to believe they were real. As the cards became currency, another story unfolded. Local news stations across the country began to report on a new phenomenon. School boards, concerned parents, and community leaders saw not an asset class, but a dangerous distraction. Television segments aired, warning of a craze that consumed children's allowances and their minds. For some, the very intensity that drove the market was proof of a darker influence. The object of this financial fascination was, to many, a moral hazard. While some saw a dangerous new obsession, corrupting youth and draining wallets, others saw only the cold logic of an emerging asset class. The company that printed the cards now understood its own trap. To print more, to make the game accessible to new players, meant destroying the value the cards held for collectors. Yet to hold back, to preserve scarcity, meant starving the very game itself of new life. The market had divided. One part demanded constant new supply, the other a guarantee of permanent absence. Wizards of the Coast had created two competing truths about its own product, and both groups were its customers. The people who owned these new assets began to demand that the company protect their investments. They lobbied against any action that would dilute the value of their cardboard. This meant Wizards of the Coast was being asked to manage a currency it had accidentally created. They were asked to limit the printing presses. The people who ran Wizards of the Coast had started a games company. They wanted to make puzzles and adventures, to publish role-playing books from a basement in Kent, Washington. But now, their every decision about how many cards to print was not a game design choice. It was a monetary policy decision. Each new release became a question of inflation or scarcity, not just player enjoyment. They were suddenly responsible for the perceived value of millions of pieces of cardboard, a value they had never intended to create. This was not the business they had imagined building. Instead, they found themselves acting as an accidental central bank, managing a currency that was also a game, and trying to please two entirely different kinds of customers at once. They had wanted players to lose themselves in fantasy. Instead, they found themselves managing an economy. The game store was no longer just a place to play. It was a place to extract value. Shops posted buy lists, offering to purchase specific cards at one rate and selling them at another. The difference was the spread. Teenagers armed with their price guides learned to exploit this. They understood that a card bought cheap from a friend could be sold at a higher rate to the store, or traded for a card the store undervalued. This was not a game. It was a market tutorial, taught across a glass counter. The market demanded perfection. Every scratch, every bent corner reduced the perceived value of these pieces of cardboard. So owners encased their cards in ever thicker layers of plastic, soft sleeves, then hard top loaders, then graded slabs. This ritual of preservation, once reserved for rare artifacts, was now applied to mass-produced paper. The condition of the card became as important as the card itself. For a generation, their first personal portfolio was not a stock certificate or a bank passbook. It was a school binder, filled with hundreds of small cardboard rectangles. Within its clear pockets, they watched their fortunes rise and fall, tracking each card's perceived worth. They learned the brutal logic of value, expressed in dollars and cents. These lessons, absorbed through colored pictures and ever-changing numbers, would shape their understanding of markets for decades to come. The fluctuating value of a rare creature card or a powerful spell became their earliest, most tangible education in finance. The game still unfolded, card by card, but in the background, a different contest was always underway, the quiet, ceaseless negotiation of perceived value. The market declared some cards precious, defining their scarcity in dollars. Meanwhile, the printing presses ran almost without pause. In just 1 year, the company would produce nearly 500 million cards. This scale of production tested the very meaning of rare. But for many, the belief in scarcity remained absolute. For 18 months, retailers had grown accustomed to ordering 10 times the cards they actually needed. They did this because Wizards of the Coast rarely filled more than a fraction of their requests. But in November 1994, the company released a new set, Fallen Empires. This time, Wizards promised to fill every order in full. And it did. Around 360 million cards arrived on a market that had only expected a tenth of that. Packs sat on shelves until 1998. Stores found they could not pay for the inventory they now held. The cards kept coming. Distributor warehouses, once emptied by a ravenous market, now filled with hundreds of millions of cards. The same pallets that had once disappeared in weeks now sat untouched for months. The system had finally produced more than people believed it was worth. The magazines that had tracked the soaring values now had a different job. Their pages, once filled with rising numbers, now printed columns of falling prices. The very grids that had made teenagers into arbitrageurs now recorded their losses. The market had decided the cardboard was not worth what it had been. The shops that had once pulsed with impatient crowds now sat in eerie quiet. The same display cases, once emptied in hours, now reflected only fluorescent lights on static product. What had felt like a secret treasure, shared among a lucky few, became mere merchandise, available to anyone who wanted it, but fewer people did. The constant rush for new cards had abruptly ended. The value, once self-evident in the frantic exchange, had become an open question. The system had, for the first time, produced more than the collective belief could sustain. Everyone had believed they were buying a game, but the market revealed they were buying absence itself. The market's sudden contraction had its echo inside the company. Wizards of the Coast had been a self-styled geektopia, a place of nerf battles and consensus. But rapid growth brought new imperatives. Consultants arrived, and with them, brand management. The founding ideal, a company shaped like a friendship, now confronted the demands of a complex business. In December 1995, around 30 staff were laid off. This was just before Christmas. The internal conflict was the war between a utopia and its own professionalization. Inside the building, a different kind of currency had also been spent. Many believed that sheer passion was an endless resource. They poured their lives into creating the games they loved. But the company had overdrawn that account too. The enthusiasm that built the empire proved to be finite. The company had been founded to make role-playing games. Now, new calculations declared that unprofitable.
The company had to find a new way to understand what the cards were for. If their value as objects was collapsing, perhaps their value lay in the playing itself. Scoff Elias, an original playtester, saw children heartbroken that the cards were too expensive to collect. He championed a radical idea: to treat magic as an intellectual sport, like golf or tennis, where skill could be rewarded. The Pro Tour was born, offering substantial prizes for competitive play. It was a way to restore value not to the cardboard, but to the minds that mastered it.
In February 1996, the first Pro Tour gathered players in a New York ballroom, transforming a hotel conference space into something new. Here, tables were carefully numbered, judges watched with keen eyes, and a substantial prize purse awaited the victor. It was a formal, serious affair, an attempt to elevate a game of cards into a respected intellectual contest.
Now, the intricate duels of Magic the Gathering unfolded not in basements, but on polished tables under bright lights. Spectators leaned forward, watching every decision, every card played. The subtle movements of strategy, once confined to private playgroups, now became a public performance. The game, in its most pure form, was finally on display.
The tournament began with 7 rounds of Swiss-style play, with each match consisting of 3 duels. At the end of the 7th round, the top 16 ranked players all advanced to the finals, where they would fight for the championship title in a single elimination bracket. From this point on, a single match loss would result in removal from the tournament.
Against the backdrop of a snow-swept city, this new stage welcomed a new kind of athlete. Young competitors, some still teenagers, arrived in their finest formal wear, ready to test their mental mettle. They sat before hushed crowds and television cameras, meticulously shuffling their decks, each card a potential turn in their fate. For these young minds, the contest was no longer just a hobby. It was a profession, an intellectual proving ground where strategy and skill could yield real, life-changing money. It was a quiet spectacle of dreams made tangible, redefining what a game and a player could truly be.
I really felt that that the game could support a high level of competition, and that at the highest level of competition you should be rewarded.
Once you give away money, it seems like the whole world says, oh, this must not just be a little game kids play. And so it's becoming a legitimate sport, something that, a respectable sport.
Here, amidst the solemnity of competition, a new kind of celebrity emerged. The victor, a social worker from Massachusetts, stepped forward to receive an oversized check, a concrete testament to his mental mastery. Cameras, once focused on dwindling card values, now captured the intense concentration of young minds, their strategies unfolding on the tables. This quiet spectacle gave the entire subculture a new public center, where intellect and skill were validated on a national stage. With the Pro Tour, the game itself, stripped of speculative value, finally stood at the forefront, celebrated for its intricate challenges and intellectual depth. The Wizards of the Coast that emerged from this period was a leaner, more disciplined operation. The days of boundless, chaotic growth were over, replaced by hard-won lessons in market realities. It had shed its founding dreams of role-playing games and its utopian ideals, finding instead a more resilient footing. But the youthful exuberance had given way to a quiet maturity, a company irrevocably changed by its own success. It was a quieter, perhaps sadder version of itself, bearing the weight of its own hard-earned wisdom and the memory of what had been lost. For a company with hundreds of new employees, The promise of a paycheck was not an ideal, but a profound obligation. The informal agreements and shared passion of a basement startup, however inspiring, could no longer secure the futures of so many. What had begun as a friendship now had to learn to be a dependable enterprise. It was the hard lesson that growth, however exhilarating, demanded a new kind of stewardship, a grown-up set of systems to keep the promises that passion alone could not sustain. The informal energy of the basement startup, once its greatest strength, slowly gave way to the structures of an actual corporation. Schedules, budgets, and reporting lines began to replace the spontaneous collaborations and shared dreams. What was gained in stability and efficiency, however, often came at the cost of that original, boundless spirit. The youthful idealism of the early days began to fade, replaced by the sober realities of managing a burgeoning empire. The company that emerged from this period, however bruised, had learned a new kind of resilience. It had been forged in the crucible of its own creation and was about to face its greatest test. For a generation of gamers, one company was the industry. TSR, based in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, was the giant. It created the very idea of role-playing games. Dungeons & Dragons, its flagship product, defined childhoods. Many believed it would simply last forever, a permanent fixture of imagination and commerce. It was the company Peter Adkison had grown up worshipping, the reason he had founded Wizards of the Coast in the first place. In Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a small hobby shop at 723 William Street was where it all began. Above that shop, a simple idea for a game had taken root. From that modest beginning, an empire grew, sprawling across continents, creating a new kind of business. Everyone who worked there believed they were part of something historic, something that would define the landscape for generations. For a time, they were right. It laid the foundations for an entire industry. Every company that followed, even its eventual buyer, built upon those same blueprints. But the ownership of that empire was not static. On October 22, 1985, in a 90-minute board meeting, control of TSR changed hands. Gary Gygax, its co-founder, watched as Lorraine Williams, whom he had hired to manage the company's finances, took over. He sued for control. He lost. Then he sold his stock and left. The system simply allowed for it. I had been engaged to address the financial solvency of the company. It became apparent that a more decisive shift in management was required to secure its future. Consequently, the board determined that the Executive Authority for Tactical Studies Rules, Inc. would be transferred to my purview. This change, while significant, was deemed necessary to ensure the ongoing viability of the enterprise. Lorraine Williams ran TSR for 12 years. She was the first woman to lead the industry's largest firm. Under her leadership, the company grossed over $40 million annually. Yet she has never spoken publicly about those years. Not once. No interviews, no memoirs, no explanations. Her silence became a defining feature of the story, a void where an account of power and ambition should have been. Gary Gygax, the founder, had created Dungeons & Dragons, but the system ensured that the game remained with the company, now under new ownership, becoming merely an asset. The new management saw a machine to optimize. More product, more lines, more shelf space. The industry's biggest firm would produce. 12 hardcover novels arrived in 1996, a significant increase from the usual 1 or 2. The goal was output, not necessarily sales. This was how the system worked. Advances were paid on product shipped, not sold. So the company shipped everything it could print. The appearance of growth became the strategy itself. The company began to reorganize itself. New departments appeared on paper, each with its own budget line. The creative work, once a passion, became a managed process. Designers, once innovators, were now personnel, their output measured and quantified. The system ensured consistency, but it also ensured distance. The company had become a factory. It no longer knew what its customers actually wanted, only what its printers could produce. TSR had a distribution deal with Random House. This agreement paid the company advances, not on what customers bought, but on what TSR shipped to the distributor. So the company learned to print product, even if no one wanted it, and send it out. Each shipment triggered an advance, which looked like revenue on the books. It was a machine that created the illusion of sales, while quietly accumulating debt. By June of 1995, TSR owed nearly $12 million. Random House then shipped back $14 million in unsold product. The publisher had accidentally built itself a debt engine. The company's output was designed to feed this machine. Full skids of novels and elaborate box sets moved through the warehouse. They were shipped not because anyone wanted to buy them, but because the count of outgoing product triggered the next payment. The distribution center became an extension of the accounting ledger. Each box was a placeholder for an advance, an illusion of commerce. It was a strategy for survival, disguised as growth. The product now returned. The numbers on the ledger, once carefully tallied as revenue, began to reverse. What had appeared to be the company's income was in fact an ever-growing obligation. The money that funded the operation had simply been borrowed against goods no one wanted. The system had created an elaborate costume, and now it was coming undone. This same lesson about the real cost of unsold product was being learned at another company, 3,000 miles away. One would survive it, the other would not. In December 1996, the mechanism finally seized. TSR effectively stopped shipping any product at all. The warehouses, once filled with the illusion of commerce, fell silent. The machine that printed unwanted goods to trigger advances could no longer be fed. The company that had invented an industry could no longer perform its most basic function. In Lake Geneva, the lights began to go out. Facing escalating financial pressure, the company's solution was always more. More game settings, each demanding new rulebooks and lore. More novels, filling entire series across the shelves. More elaborate box sets, each a world unto itself. The catalog expanded relentlessly, becoming a sprawling, uncoordinated effort. Its own products now competed directly for attention, battling each other on the same store fixtures. It was a strategy of sheer volume, believed to be the path to salvation. The logic was simple. If one product sold, many products would sell more. So new lines appeared constantly, each designed to capture a different corner of the market. But the market was finite. Instead of expanding the pie, the new products simply ate into each other, competing for the same limited dollars. It was internal war disguised as growth. The strategy of volume filled the warehouses. Trailers of Dragon Dice sat unsold. 12 hardcover novels, far more than anyone needed, moved through the system. But this outward show of activity concealed a profound internal breakdown. TSR stopped paying its printer, J.B. Kenahan. The printer, in turn, held the production plates for Dungeons & Dragons hostage. The owner of the world's most famous game could not print its own books. The industry's giant had become a publisher that could not publish. The outward show of production had become a different kind of flood. It was a flood of invoices the company could no longer pay. In the early spring of 1997, as the last traces of winter melted from the fields of Wisconsin, Peter Adkison found himself driving east toward Lake Geneva. Beside him was Ryan Dancy, an executive from Five Rings Publishing, but more importantly, a fellow pilgrim. They were on a mission to see the company that had once seemed an untouchable colossus, TSR, the owner of Dungeons & Dragons, now dying. For these two men, lifelong players of the game, this journey was freighted with a quiet, complex emotion. They had spent their childhoods dreaming in the worlds TSR had created, inspired by its maps and monsters, its endless possibilities. Now, they were driving not just to acquire a business, but to witness the end of an era, hoping to rescue the very spirit that had first drawn them to the game. It was an elegy on wheels, a quiet procession to the place where their own stories began. The road itself seemed to stretch back through time, bringing their younger selves closer with every mile. There was the solemn weight of witnessing a collapse, the dread of finding a kingdom in ruins. But for these pilgrims, the ghost of every adventure they had ever imagined also rode along, huddled in the back seat. They checked into a motel that night, the cold slush clinging to the parking lot. As the weight of the coming morning's meeting settled over them. When the light of morning finally broke, Peter Adkison and Ryan Dancy stepped into the vast halls of TSR's warehouse. Here, stacked from floor to ceiling, stretched the physical history of the company's recent years. Millions of dollars in unsold games and books stood shrink-wrapped, gathering dust in silent rows. For Peter Adkison, walking these vast, silent aisles was like gazing into a distorted mirror. The towering stacks of unsold games, the forgotten products, the sheer volume of cardboard with nowhere left to go. This was the very cliff edge Wizards of the Coast had stood upon only 2 years earlier. They too had known the dizzying rush of unlimited printing, the belief that demand would never cease.
They too had flooded the market with fallen empires, creating a glut that nearly swallowed their own company whole. But Wizards had pulled back, made the hard choices, learned the brutal arithmetic of the market. TSR, it seemed, had continued to print its way to ruin, mistaking activity for actual sales. The lesson laid bare in the cold air of this warehouse was tragically clear. The same storm had broken both companies, but only one had learned to navigate the wreckage. This was not just TSR's tomb. It was a ghost of Wizard's own near death.
And in that moment, the true cost of TSR's mistakes became clear. It would be bought with the very wisdom its own downfall had forged. The negotiations, unfolding over stacks of balance sheets and legal paper, were not merely about numbers. For roughly $25 to $30 million, a sum that largely covered TSR's crushing debts, Wizards of the Coast would acquire the fallen giant. But Peter Adkison saw more than an asset. He paid out personal checks to the original creators, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and Gygax's ex-wife, to settle old, lingering royalty claims. He mandated that Dungeons & Dragons would forever credit its founders, ensuring their legacy. And he offered jobs to most of TSR's staff, promising them a new home far away from Lake Geneva, in Renton, Washington. This was not just a business transaction. It was a rescue, an act of reverence, underwritten by a boy's enduring love for the game that had shaped his life.
On April 10, 1997, we announced the acquisition of TSR Inc. This momentous occasion marked a significant step for Wizards of the Coast. For myself, and indeed for many within our company, it represented the culmination of a deeply held ambition. As I shared publicly at that time, what gamer wouldn't want to be part of the company that bought D&D?
On June 3, 1997, the final papers were signed, turning a boyhood dream into a binding reality.
The finalization of the deal rippled through the gaming world, a profound shift barely understood in its moment. But for Peter Adkison, it marked a quiet return to bedrock. The stories that had first opened his mind, the monsters and heroes that had populated his childhood dreams, were now his to protect and nurture. The company he had built from nothing, born of inspiration from these very pages, had come full circle. Dungeons and Dragons, the game that had once seemed to him an infinite possibility, was now truly safe, ready for its next adventure, under the care of a lifelong devotee.
The team moved from Lake Geneva to Renton that summer, and Dungeons and Dragons, under its new stewardship, was profitable again within roughly 3 months.
But the purchase encompassed more than just a famous name and a troubled balance sheet. It was also a commitment to the living history contained within TSR's walls, to the untold stories and nascent worlds still waiting to be discovered. Wizards embraced the archives, the handwritten ledgers of Gary Gygax, and the creative seeds of other games like The Legend of the Five Rings, which came along with the acquisition. They sought to preserve the very spirit of invention that had once made TSR a beacon, bringing its creators and their visions into a new era. What arrived was not merely an established intellectual property, but a future, unwritten and full of possibility, entrusted to those who understood its delicate magic.
It was a homecoming, not just for the staff who moved west, but for the very spirit of Dungeons and Dragons itself. A generation of players who had once gathered around kitchen tables and in basements now saw their beloved game entrusted to one of their own. Peter Adkison, the minister's son who had built a company out of passion, understood the quiet contract. He knew that what he had acquired was not merely a set of rules and characters, but a shared imaginative space, a cultural touchstone for millions. This was the inheritance of a community, passed into the hands of those who had learned its magic firsthand.
And so, the game that had first sparked his own imagination, the vast world of Dungeons and Dragons, would not only survive, but thrive, guarded by the very passion it had inspired.
It was, well, and I remember Tom Dusenberry, who was a VP at Hasbro. It was shortly after that he called me and introduced himself and said that he had met my wife and a bunch of my employees at Nuremberg Toy Fair and said, just looking forward to buying you guys someday. It was just what he said.
When the time is right. But at the time, the quoted price was $5 million, which wound up substantially lower.
Yeah. We held out for more. It's probably a smart decision.
Just a little bit. But they just thought, oh, flash in the pan, fad, if you're still around.
Right.
By September 1999, the Basement Company had grown into something far beyond its founder's wildest imaginings. Hasbro, the toy giant, looked at the numbers and made its offer. $325 million for Wizards of the Coast. It was a sum that transformed the lives of those who had believed in the earliest days, when shares were just 50 cents apiece. Friends who had written checks for a few $100s or exchanged their work for a small stake now found themselves wealthy. And then there was Mary, the Boeing janitor, who had entrusted her life savings to Peter Adkison. Her $1,400 investment once thought foolish by her own children, was now worth a fortune, a quiet testament to a faith that had paid off beyond measure. It was the moment the dream, built on friendship and cards, became a legacy.
A framed certificate now hung on the wall, marking the final entry in a ledger that began in a basement.
From Mary, the quiet janitor from Boeing, her belief had been rewarded hundreds of times over. Her initial investment, a simple act of faith from her life savings, had multiplied several hundredfold by the time of the sale. It meant a quiet comfort, a security that had once seemed impossible in her life. She had seen something in Peter Adkison's late-night work, a spark that others missed, a promise in the basement. And in the end, that small, trusting gesture had reshaped her future entirely, offering a measure of peace she might never have dreamed of. It was a fortune that few had predicted, and one she had earned with a simple, human trust. This quiet payoff, for a janitor who simply believed, became a touchstone for the company's own journey.
Yet, beneath the soaring valuations and the transformed lives, the original puzzle remained. What, after all, is money? For centuries, economists had offered elaborate theories, charting its flow, its forms, its functions. They spoke of gold standards, fiat currencies, and market efficiencies. But the Black Lotus, printed on a simple sheet of cardboard decades earlier, cut through the academic debates. It demonstrated that money was, above all, a shared conviction, a collective agreement made solid. And if enough people kept telling that story, then the card, still just cardboard, remained worth something.
But at the heart of it all, long after the ledgers were closed and the fortunes made, the game itself endured. The cards found their way back to kitchen tables, to quiet cafes, to dorm rooms where friends gathered. New generations shuffled their decks, building new stories and forging fresh connections, often unaware of the financial tides that had once swirled around these very pieces of cardboard. The game, in its most fundamental form, simply continued. It was a testament not to abstract value, but to the enduring human desire to gather, to play, and to share in a world imagined together.
The true worth, it seemed, was measured not in auctions or ledgers, but in the quiet joy of a shuffled deck, passed across a kitchen table. Once more, a simple game.
Beyond the fluctuating prices and the grand corporate deals, the real story quietly unfolds wherever players gather. Decades after its invention, the game remains a living, breathing landscape of strategy and imagination. Cards are still drawn, still carefully shuffled, still cast in moments of tension and triumph. The simple act of playing, forged in basements and convention halls, continued to be its own enduring reward. Long after the market's roar had faded, the quiet sound of cards being shuffled remained. Decades on, the intricate artwork and familiar frames still passed from hand to hand, a physical echo of countless battles. Players still drew, still cast, still sought victory in the vibrant worlds printed on mere cardboard. The game, in its simplest form, kept its promise to be played.
The economists had spent centuries mapping the intricate flows of capital, constructing models of supply and demand, explaining value through labor or utility.
But this small, fragile rectangle of cardboard offered a simpler, starker truth. Its worth, soaring and plummeting, was never tied to gold or industry or even its own physical form. It was tied only to the stories people told about it, the memories they invested, the future they believed it held. This small, accidental economy, born in a basement, revealed the hidden mechanism of all markets, a vast collective act of storytelling. The card became an honest mirror, reflecting not intrinsic value, but the volatile, beautiful, and utterly human agreement to believe.
The Black Lotus had shown that financial value was a collective hallucination, but the cardboard, once removed from the market, still served its first purpose. The game, the friendship, the shared experience, these things did not crash. They were not subject to price guides or speculative bubbles. They simply remained. This was the other lesson, that some things, after all, held their worth the whole time. A quiet, inconvenient truth for all the economists.